Welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar on a brand new book. It's Considerate to Be Literate about religion. We're going to talk today about chaplains and religious literacy, and especially how that interacts with and is significant. I don't know why I'm getting tongue-tied. I talk all day. Religious literacy for children. So we thank you all for joining us. Let me just say a few words on behalf of the lab, and then I'll introduce our guests, and we'll get started. So like all of our events, or most of our events anyway, this is being recorded. And so don't worry too much about taking notes or anything like that. If you miss a point or you want to come back to it, you can always do that later. You get a copy of that recording via email here in the next couple of days. In that same email, there's a link to a very brief survey about your experience here. Please do just take 30 seconds to fill that out. That's where we find out whether we're doing a good job or maybe a less good job, what you want to hear about, what you'd like to learn about. It's important as we plan our programming. So please do fill that out. With that, let me introduce our guests, and I will turn it over to them. First, we have Dr. Steven Cunningham, who is director of pancreatic and hepatobiliary surgery at Ascension St. Agnes in Baltimore. So he is a surgeon, a medical doctor, and I forget now which program you were in at Harvard Divinity School, but he is also a student of religion. So he is certainly someone who is crossing a lot of those paths that chaplains find themselves in. And he's the author, of course, of the book under discussion. There is a nice, significant discount for the lab community. And so once we get underway, I'll put that in chat for how you can go about ordering that book. And then we're also joined by his colleague, Dr. Beth Muehlhausen, who is a chaplain researcher. She's done all kinds of work in spiritual care, and she's worked with Steven on this question of religious literacy. So with that, Steven, let me turn it to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you so much for that kind introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you see the cover slide? Okay, terrific. So yeah, so thank you very much, Michael, and thank you, of course, to Wendy for also making this happen and for all of the wonderful work that you all are doing with the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. Just give me 1 second to get to the right page here. Okay, you still see the title slide?
Yep, it's back now. Looks great.
Okay, fantastic. So, yeah, so I'm really happy to be here today to be talking about the spiritual care of patients and of each other. Not just each other in our healthcare communities, but I think importantly, each other in our personal and political and social lives also. And of course, to be discussing my new book, which is called It's Considered to Be Literate About Religion, Poetry and Prose About Religion, Conflict, and Peace in Our World. The origin and future of this book, I think, are very related to this paper by Tracy Balboni and colleagues, which came out just a few months ago, a paper most of you probably know, which, as others have said, is likely the most important paper in the last 20 years or so on the intersection of healthcare and religion and spirituality. It reviews evidence in a pretty rigorous way that suggests we clinicians must proactively incorporate spiritual care into our practice, care which is person-centered and value-sensitive. Because we know that patients want and need spiritual care to be part of their care plan. But despite that, we clinicians, maybe especially we surgeons, are not by and large comfortable enough with religious literacy to do that. To help remedy the situation, I'm currently doing two things. The first thing is planning this study as part of my master's in religion at Harvard, looking at religious literacy among healthcare providers, particularly surgeons and oncologists, since they're the ones who are often working with patients who are at a time of crisis, such as the need for an operation or a new diagnosis of cancer. And the other thing that I'm doing is, of course, is this book, which we are discussing today. So what is this book about? Well, this book is a book of poetry and prose, a lot like my first two books. This is my third book. My first two, they're all kids' books, and they're all poetry and prose. The first two are for a younger group. They're really straight up kid book, like picture books, interior, lots of color pictures, 8.5 by 11, not too many words on each page. One about dinosaurs, one about the body. This one is also poetry and prose, but this one is about religious literacy and about religion, peace, and conflict in our world. It's in 3 sections, and I'll show you the table of contents in just a second. And with each poem followed by a learn more section, which is also a motif that I had in the previous poems, but whereas the last book may have had a small little box at the bottom of each poem for a learn more section, so the kids can learn more about that particular aspect of anatomy or physiology in the book about the body. In this new book, the learn more sections are actually much more expansive and may go on for several pages. And importantly, it's really a book for all ages, probably not much younger than 10 or 12. It indeed looks like and is a kid's book, but really it's also for and maybe even more so for the adults in the lives of kids. So here's a table of contents. So part 1 is about nomenclature. This is also sort of a trope or a motif I use in the other 2 books, where I start by talking about the names of things, sort of give the whole topic traction. So, here the relevant terms that I review are literacy, religion, scripture. And in part 2 are examples of conflicts that revolve around religion, such as in Syria, Nigeria, Myanmar. Part 3 is a short 2-page appendix, putting it all together, that reviews ways that we often are religiously illiterate without even realizing it, and ways that we can be more religiously literate in our daily lives. There's also a glossary in which all of the bold-faced words in the text are defined. And there's a reading group guide with topics and questions for further discussion. So some questions that I think are important to ask here are, 1, what is this thing called religion anyway? What exactly do I mean by religious literacy? Because there are several notions of religious literacy. I'm going to be using the one used by the American Academy of Religion, which is very concept-based notion of religious literacy. But that's not the only notion of religious literacy. There are also more fact-based notions of religious literacy. I think a good example of that is Stephen Prothero's book about religious literacy that was on the New York Times bestseller list for I think, a long while. But what is religious literacy, and how can we be more religiously literate? And these 2 questions are, of course, bound up together, because the degree to which we're clear about what we mean by religious literacy is, of course, helpful for being more intentional about being more religiously literate in our daily lives. So what is this thing called religion anyway? Is it the scripture that is associated with a particular religion? Or is a religion defined by the rites, rituals, and ceremonies that are associated with a religion? Maybe it's just the beliefs of a particular faith community, or maybe religion really just depends on the individual. It is, of course, all of these and none of them alone. But one of the first poems in the book is actually called "What is Religion?" And I didn't actually ask you, Michael, if it was okay. Is it okay if I just read a couple of poems from the book?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So I'll read a couple of poems, probably only one learn more section. And this first one is called "What is Religion?" I'm going to use the actual book here because the text is a little small on the screen. So, and I should preface this reading by noting that this poem mentions Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's a philosopher, considered by many to be the most, or maybe one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, if not the past several centuries. He was an Austrian philosopher who is famous for, among other things, his concept of family resemblance, which the Learn More section explains, and his idea that meaning depends on use. And that seemingly perplexing metaphysical problems that have often plagued philosophers, often are just a result of philosophers being confused about the way they're defining things or using language. So that was one of the things he was sort of known for. So what is religion? Religion is hard to define. Just ask Ludwig Wittgenstein. He's a philosopher from Austria whose brain got nausea trying to define various things. Not blocks, rocks, rings, and springs, words that name stuff you can touch, but rather truth, soul, mind, and such. These things you can't see or weigh, So defining them, well, it's hard to say. But then Ludwig saw, saving his sanity, that some things are defined by resemblance in a family. Like all games, religions are all in some way alike, having a family resemblance, if you like. No single feature do they share, yet a certain similarity is there. When Ludwig realized a word's meaning is its use, from his nauseating confusion, he finally got loose. Religion is a word doing a job, like a tool. Yes, it's about God as a general rule, but not always. Even more in this case, it's a description of what in life actually takes place. And if you find a good priest, rabbi, imam, or Brahmin, they'll know it's also what separates the sacred from the common. If we could ask Ludwig how he construes it, he might say, well, it depends on how I use it. So that's one of the first poems in the book. And like I mentioned before, some of the Learn More sections, they're all much more expansive than in my other books, but some go on for less than a page and some go on for 3 or 4 pages. This one is just about a page and a half. So maybe to give you the whole flavor of a poem Learn More section pair, I'll just read this also. This will be the only Learn More section that I will read, because I do want to save enough time for discussion. So learn more about defining religion. There are several ways to define things. For example, triangular is defined as having 3 sides. All triangles have 3 sides, and all shapes with 3 sides are triangular. In other words, having 3 sides is both necessary and sufficient for being a triangle. It is essential to being a triangle. This is an essentialist definition, and essentialist definitions like this one are one type of definition, but they do not work well in all cases. What about games, for example? That was the example that philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein used to show his idea of family resemblance. It is hard or impossible to come up with a list of what is both necessary and sufficient for being a game. Consider, what is needed to define a game? Having teams, but then solitaire would not be a game. Having a winner and a loser, but then catch wouldn't be a game. There are board games, ball games, Olympic games, word games, puzzle games, video games, and many more. And what they all have in common is hard to determine. So we cannot name all the essential conditions for games like we can for triangles. However, we can define such things based on the ways they are similar to each other. In other words, we can define things like games using a number of qualities that are typical of games, such as having teams, having a winner and a loser, being enjoyable, and so on, even though not all games have every one of these qualities. The fancy term for this kind of definition is polythetic, and this is a really good way to define religions too. Like games, religions do not have every single quality in common with each other, but they do share many similarities. For example, although the definitions for some common religions refer to God, like Christianity, or gods, like Hinduism, such theist, and there's our first bold-faced glossary word of the book, such theist definitions are rather foreign to other religions, like Buddhism, that do not really stress worship of God or gods. Despite this big difference, all 3 of these are still religions. Therefore, we can define religion as follows. Religions are things that are made in response to the experienced world by people who live within a culture and a society and that are all similar to each other in a family resemblance sort of way. Nearly always involving shared experiences in a community and a shared set of beliefs about the transcendent, often including worship of God or gods, and typically stressing a separation between the sacred and the commonplace. So a lot of the Learn More sections are different from each other, but that's one example of them. And then a couple of pages later, since scripture is such an important part of many or all religions, there's actually a poem called Scripture. And this will probably be the second and only other poem I'll read from the book. This happens to be one of my favorite spreads, by the way, of the book. The illustrator is Susan Detweiler, who also did my body book, but this is a much different style. And I was surprised she chose to pick a woman scribe. And I looked this up, and it actually turns out that women were indeed scribes, even in ancient times, even though we often don't think of scribes as women. But this poem is called Scripture. Scripture, ancient words in black and white, dance in shadows of candlelight, from mouths of men in tribes to the plumed pens of scribes. Before books, words on tongues survived, till finally on pages they arrived. Though how in the end the stories got penned, hides the ways they bend, first told aloud, friend to friend. And even when first written down, words copied by hand changed town to town. A scribe, after all, is not a copy machine. Scribes made changes, both seen and unseen, toiling beneath their candlelight, making gray seem black and white. So that's the scripture poem, and its learn more section does go on for 4 pages here, and I won't read the whole thing, but it does go into what scripture is and isn't, how it came to be written down, the role of oral histories, which is beautifully illustrated, I think, by this illustration on page 21, one of my favorite illustrations in the book. And then the learn more section goes on the next couple pages to talk about the role of scribes, talk about the all caps punctuationless text of many ancient manuscripts, including this illustration, as I've blown up here, which happens to be this not a random sequence of Greek letters, but the text from 1 Timothy 3:16, when Paul is talking about the mystery of Jesus being manifest in the flesh. And the learn more section goes on to talk about the role that copying manuscripts played in the competition of various Christianities in the first century. So it goes into the weeds a little bit with some points about scripture. So moving on from defining religion to defining religious literacy, so this is our other second and third question of those 3 questions. I'm going to list here just the 5 tenets of religious literacy that I cover in the book, and then we'll touch on each of them a little more in depth and still leave some time for questions. So the first one is distinguishing the inside from the outside. The second one is recognizing that religions are internally diverse and dynamic. The third one is understanding that religions lack agency. Number 4 is appreciating religious influences. And finally, recognizing our perspective or our situatedness, a term that I really like. So the first one, what do I mean by distinguishing the inside versus the outside? So this is an important tenet of religious literacy, and maybe one of the hardest for some people to get their head around. But by the inside, I mean a prescriptive, devotional, or confessional theological approach to religion. This is what people do, what Catholics, for example, do in Mass on Sundays. As opposed to the outside, which is a descriptive, analytical, cultural studies approach. And the difference between these 2 ways of engaging with religion is illustrated, I think, when looking at groups like the Westboro Baptist Church, which, as many of you probably know, is a Christian hate group in Topeka, Kansas, or ISIS or Al-Qaeda, Muslim terrorist organizations. Because we often hear and find ourselves asking, is Westboro Baptist Church practicing true Christianity? Or is ISIS true Islam? And while those are, I think, important questions, they're even more importantly questions that are asked within a religion. Because it's right, I think, to question very violent interpretations of religion. And that questioning of the interpretation happens within a religion. I think it's dangerous to think that you're working outside of the religion from a descriptive analytical approach and say, oh, that's not true Islam or not true Christianity, because that implies that there is one true of any religion, and there isn't, because religions aren't like that. And another danger, I think, of just writing them off as that's not true Christianity or that's not true Islam, is it prevents us from asking really important questions. Like, for example, what is it about the Westboro Baptist Church that allows them to still exist? Or what is it about ISIS that attracts so many recruits? And so just writing them off prevents us from asking those important questions. And this gets a little bit to what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has called the single story. If you haven't seen her TED Talk, I would highly recommend it. If you just put her name and the single story in a Google search, it's the first hit. And so this term of hers, a single story, is dangerous because, as she describes, it's incomplete. And the single story emphasizes how we're different rather than how we're similar. And it makes it easy for cultural violence to occur. And Galtung's typology of violence, Galtung was a sort of the father of peace studies. He's the one who coined the term cultural violence and structural violence. And of course, there's direct violence that you see and experience. That's another sort of motif that runs through the book. So that's distinguishing the inside versus the outside. A little more straightforward is the second tenet of religious literacy, which is recognizing that religions are internally diverse and dynamic. It seems obvious to say it, but sometimes it's easy to forget that all Christians, Muslims, Hindus, agnostics are not the same as everyone else in those faith traditions. Indeed, there are multiple legitimate interpretations because religions are both internally and temporally diverse. In other words, they're diverse themselves and they're dynamic over time. So to ask, is Christianity or is Islam a religion of peace? Again, is to assume a homogeneity that just doesn't exist because religions aren't like that. They're not monolithic. In fact, one of the poems in the book is actually called Monolithic that delves into that a little bit more. And number three is understanding that religions lack agency. So this came up a lot during the 2016 election or even after other times after 9/11 when we heard the expression Islam hates us, which is really a gross manifestation of religious illiteracy because religions don't hate or love anybody. They don't do anything, in fact, because they aren't actors with agency. People are, and people hate and love and do things. And what we do matters. And this, again, is similar to what I said on the last slide about peace and violence being a sort of a core through the book. I try to really make the point for younger and older readers that neither peace nor violence is inevitable. We humans are actors with agency. Religions aren't, but we are, and what we do matters. So number four is appreciating religious influences, which exist in all parts of public life and culture. Sometimes obviously, sometimes not. Obviously, religions are private, but the point here is they're not merely private. And finally, recognizing our perspective, our situatedness, because it's very easy to forget that the only place from which we can know, experience, understand the world and its religions is, you guessed it, precisely where we happen to be. In other words, no one can pull off what Donna Haraway has called the God trick, which is another term that I really like. So the God trick is being able to see everything from nowhere, which of course nobody could do because we're all somewhere. And so then from that, the whole first part of the book sort of goes into those 5 tenets of religious literacy, using poems, and there are more sections to illustrate and explore them. And the second part of the book is about religious conflicts around the world. But just so we have time for discussion, I'll skip to part 3, which is this very short 2-page appendix putting it all together, where we have a recap of the ways on the left that we're often religiously illiterate without even realizing it. And on the right, ways that we can be more intentional about being religiously literate in our daily lives, including a lot of cross-referencing with the different page numbers where the topics are explored. So I'm going to stop there and open up to discussion. This is the QR code you can use. And I know that Michael said he would put it in the chat, but that's actually the code that I had the publisher made for this. That'll get you up to a 35% discount for the book if you put in CIL for Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. Here's some advanced praise from the book for some early readers. And one of our early readers was Beth, who was with us here today. So I'll yield the floor to Beth and let her provide a response from the perspective of a chaplain to kick off the discussion.
Well, first, thank you so much, Steve, for such an innovative, timely, and important book. Since we are, I'm assuming, mostly chaplains on this call, I've geared my responses primarily towards a chaplain audience. Next slide, please.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the strengths of the book, as I see them, are that Steve breaks down the concepts in a really easy to understand language that's very engaging to the reader so that they want to learn more. He educates the reader through poetry, education, and examples, again, in a way that is not academically stuffy, but is engaging and pleasant, and dare I say fun, even though it's a heavier topic. His ability to separate religion from the actions of persons who interpret their religion in violent ways, in my opinion, is exceedingly timely in promoting religious cultural humility. We live in a very divided country. We live in a time when people are not willing to engage or have conversations with each other. And I'm struck by stories of, forgive me, I believe it was Ronald Reagan, who would disagree with Democrats and then they'd still go out for a beer at the end of a congressional meeting. And in that notion that we could disagree but still be in community, I think is one that's so lacking in our present times. I separated this last piece because I really kind of want to punch each word that I've listed. And that is, I think the content promotes curiosity in terms of what else can we learn? And he just kind of scratches the surface. And so in my opinion, I was left a little wanting, like, oh, I would like to learn more about X, Y, and Z. It's certainly a book that promotes tolerance. So he doesn't use that language per se. He talks about literacy, but I would say it very much promotes tolerance in a way that builds community, that doesn't take away from my beliefs, but also creates room and space for the beliefs of the other person I'm dialoguing with. And then in that vein, understanding. Next slide. So he highlighted this, but I really want to punch it home, in my opinion. It's marketed as a children's book. And I would almost disagree with this labeling because I think it's essential for adults. Not just an interesting read for adults, but it's an essential read for adults. And especially for those of us who are in the religious realm. Because in my opinion, it's adults who teach the hate, the intolerance, the exclusivity, and the violence. You know, there's all kinds of documentation that says children aren't born hating. They're taught that by their environment and the people around them, which is why I'm strongly advocating for adults. Yeah, go ahead. I think sometimes the problem with promoting religious literacy, or at least when I was in seminary and taking liberation theologies, it's that you end up preaching to the choir, meaning you're preaching to those people who are already open. And so how can we start to educate folks who may not choose proactively to look at a book like this? And how can we expand our understanding? So next slide. So here are just some of Beth's suggested uses of the book. I know that a team between Ascension and Transforming Chaplaincy did a project where we interviewed leaders, spiritual care department leaders during the pandemic, and we started asking questions about race and how they were dealing with issues of race. As we had Black Lives Matter come up, Asian hate was on the rise. And one of the things folks did in their departments was read books together, particularly say White Fragility, anything that opened up dialogue and helped people expand their thinking. And I think this book would be wonderful for that kind of endeavor, whether it's in, regardless of setting. So I'm most familiar with healthcare settings, but I think even, reading in a prison setting where you're engaging prisoners in looking at that, or military, I think it's really beneficial in that regard. One of the key things that hopefully chaplains take away from CPE education is this notion that it's not about my faith or spirituality. It's how can I help you make sense and meaning from the standpoint of your faith tradition or even non-faith tradition. And so I think this book does a really nice job of kind of separating all that out and making it more about dialogue and community and journeying together, rather than taking the stance of it's mine or nothing, mine is the only way, etc. And then I know there are a lot of job environments where people can get jobs as a chaplain and not have had CPE training. And so again, I think this book is a wonderful way for them to just educate themselves. And then lastly, I think it would be really helpful to just focus on maybe some discussion groups for interdisciplinary staff, depending on your setting, so that the chaplain is leading a book club or a discussion for their peers, social workers, case managers, doctors. You'd have to help me out in other settings, but hopefully you get my point of how can we then be that leader in educating other people who work with patients, clients, etc., soldiers, and help them to understand this concept of religious literacy, so we can be in more community together rather than taking that adversarial approach with one another. The next slide. So you are more than welcome to throw out some other suggestions for questions, topics to discuss. But these were meant to be kind of just to get us going. So first, what do you all think of Steve's concept of the inside, that prescriptive, devotional, confessional, theological versus the outside, which is more descriptive and analytical and cultural? Do you agree with me that all chaplains in all settings need to be religiously literate? We're in a dialogue here, so maybe you can say, oh, that's nuts. I hope you don't, but you're welcome to, and tell me why then. I would say, tell us why you don't think this is needed for chaplains. And then what other ideas do you have for utilizing this content in your chaplain practice or in chaplaincy in general as a profession? So with that, you could pick any one of these questions. You can pick something of your own, but I would say let's open it up to discussion. And once again, I want to thank Steve for just an incredible content and timely. I read it initially as a favor to him, and I have to say, I was so jazzed afterwards and was so grateful that I had agreed to do him this favor because it was so enriching to me. So with that being said, I will now be quiet and let you have discussion time with Steve.
Thank you very much, Beth and Steve. This is, the level of engagement with just the concept of religion here is so important, because this is the heart of how a chaplain engages with folks across lines, having this level of knowledge of what religion is, what it does, not just I have mine, you have yours, isn't that great? But to be able to take another step back from that is just so important, and you've really distilled it here in a way that I think is really interesting. I just want to go through a couple of questions that are in the chat here, and you can also use the Q&A if you like. There's that function there at the bottom. One person says, is Judaism covered in this book? I think the answer is yes, but I'm going to let Steve expand on that.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, no religion is covered like in the way that what I kind of think of as an old-fashioned like world religions book covers it. Like, here are the 5 pillars of this, here are the 10 commandments of that. Because again, I try really hard not to be fact-based And it's not, and I talk about this a little bit in the introductory part, but it's not that it's bad or unhelpful to know facts. It's, in fact, it's super helpful. I'm a big fan of facts and knowing lots of them, but I think it doesn't get you as far as, facts only get you so far without understanding. And, Stephen Prothero's book is very fact-based. I mean, his conception, I don't want, my interpretation of his conception is it's very fact-based. And in fact, it feels to me even a little bit like it's not really religious literacy, but it's Protestant literacy, because he makes a really good point, which is that the US by and large is run by white male Protestants. And so, our political and social arenas are full of references to that. And if you want to be a good citizen, you need to know a lot about Protestantism. And he makes a good point, but that in my mind isn't really religious literacy. So back to the question. So yeah, I do not provide a lot of facts about Judaism, nor about Christianity or about Islam, but Judaism, of course, being one of the three major Abrahamic religions, is a central role in the book. In fact, several of the early reviewers were either Jewish scholars or rabbis or Jewish chaplains.
Eileen, I see you have your hand up, so let me just click on that and you can ask your question. All right, have at it, Eileen.
Hold on. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Hi. First of all, I've been enjoying this very much. I actually, if I had time, I would get into that class that you wanted to be within Doctor. I would have enjoyed it. So I am in a hospital in Evanston, Illinois, an extremely diverse hospital called St. Francis Hospital, which is Ascension. I was in academics for a while. I had a pulpit for a while, and I've been in chaplaincy for 26 years this last month. So at this hospital, at this own hospital, we have at least 52 different languages probably spoken here throughout the year, because it's so diverse. And it's because of the neighborhood that we surround, that surrounds us. Okay. So I do a lot of educating to colleagues and to physicians, and I do it all the time. So what I stated in the chat is that anti-Semitism is an extreme height right now in the United States because of the political atmosphere in this country. And when I was in college, the United Nations voted that Zionism is racism, and that began the beginning of the United Nations campaign against, I would say, Judaism, not just Israel, but against Judaism. So I think what I said in my chat is that I don't say the word tolerance, I say acceptance. Tolerance means I tolerate you. Acceptance means I accept you. And I think that's what we have to come to in our country to get better connectedness to each other. So I just wanted to offer that to you, because I think Beth mentioned the word tolerance. That's not, to me, a positive word. That's kind of like, okay, you're here. So I would just say that, use a different word. Maybe.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think it's in this book, or it might be in my, I did a physician response to, so Ascension and Transforming Chaplaincy collaborated on a group of journals written by chaplains during the pandemic called In Their Own Words, which is available through the Transforming Chaplaincy website. And I wrote their physician's response to that. I can't honestly remember, even though it sounds silly to say so, if it was in that or in the book, but I make that same point that Eileen just made, because I think it's a really important one. That, I mean, tolerance is a lot better than intolerance, of course, but it's not very much. I mean, merely tolerating someone isn't very much. I mean, it's and so I feel like the more you the more familiar you are with something or somebody, the more you understand them, the more you know them, the more likely you are to embrace them, because that's just how humans are. I mean, we're very tribal, right? I mean, we're very sensitive in a deep, I think, very subconscious way to in-group versus out-group. And so the more you know and understand someone and are religiously literate, then the easier it is to make that embrace and to not merely tolerate someone. I mean, tolerating someone is tolerance is great, but it's a little bit of a low bar. I agree, we need to go beyond that.
Thank you.
Stephen, as you're working, with other students and scholars of religion, as well as physicians and others that are in direct, sort of medical services. What sort of reactions have you had to this work? I mean, I'm imagining there's just this whole range, but maybe I'm wrong. But what do people think about this work that you're trying to do here? Because I don't think there's many doctors that are doing this.
Yeah, so I'm anticipating a lot more of those reactions coming, because that study that I mentioned is really just underway. Like it hasn't really started yet. Like it's gonna be my thesis program, and then I've planned out, I think, the next several years of doing this study in religious literacy in healthcare workers, looking at oncologists and surgeons, and it's going to involve a lot of like getting really down in the weeds with people about these topics, and I think I'll get a lot more of those reactions. Now I think, I mean, people know I wrote this book, and they're just like, oh, it's just, he's doing something interesting. So, it's interesting, actually. It's an interesting question, because you find out right away from people who from people's reactions, like which buttons are pressed. Sure. Like for people who've had run-ins with religious intolerance, as a chaplain or as a provider, their antennae go up and are like, oh, that's it. That's exactly what I was talking about the other day. For other people who tend to, and we all do this a little bit, at least a lot of us clinicians do, have our nose to the grindstone just a little too much and kind of miss what's happening on the periphery. I think it just goes right by them. And so that's the fact that there isn't, I guess what I'm saying is the fact that there isn't a big reaction from some clinicians, in my mind, just highlights the need for broader religious literacy, because it's really easy to go through your clinical day and not tend to spiritual care. It's actually pretty easy to do. But you miss a lot of important cases of spiritual distress. I mean, especially when you in a job like mine, when I'm often one of the first people telling someone, or really going into the details with them about the fact that they have a new diagnosis of pancreatic cancer and we can't take it out. Yeah, so it's a good question. And as you might imagine, the responses are sort of all across the board, from zero to wow, that's great, to why are you doing that?
Well,
chime in here too. Oh, sorry, Michael.
No, Beth, please go ahead.
I'll chime in here too as a researcher, that there is research out there that says, even though a chaplain is helpful, don't get me wrong, I'm here all day to say chaplains are essential. By the same token, oftentimes people still want their physician. They still want the clinical team, the nurses, the doctors, the respiratory therapists to address their religious needs. Absolutely. And so we can't just put it in this bucket, in my mind, of chaplains addressing all of those needs and being religiously literate. I think somehow, I won't put the onus just on Steve, but somehow us chaplain partners with Steve, need to help normalize this, that this is something that physicians and clinicians need to at least have a basic understanding of.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's, this was not planned at all, but it is interesting. Now I can mention, because of what you just said, Beth, this is something the lab is trying to address directly with what we just launched recently, the spiritual generalist training, which will bring in healthcare clinicians and train them and to say, look, here is where spirituality generally fits in to someone's physical issues or needs. It's not the same for everyone, but here is what you should be aware of. Here are the types of things that you might want to consider talking about. And here's how you would refer that on to a chaplain, so that it becomes much more a continuum of care that involves spirituality, instead of what you just said, Beth, of, well, wait till the chaplain comes. We can't talk about that. That's something for them. And yeah. So, and chaplains and myself all the time, we say, of course, healthcare providers, they need to be more religiously literate. They need to be aware of spirituality, this, that, and the other. I'm interested in how that becomes operationalized, So Stephen, you mentioned a lot of times you're the first person telling this person, you aren't going to live very much longer. So
Mm.
when does this come up in your conversations? If we're over here saying doctors need to know more about spirituality and religion, okay, you do know more about it. So where does that come up in your practice?
Yeah. Can I, Michael?
Yeah.
Oh.
It comes up in all kinds of different places, and sometimes unexpected. Sometimes I think it's really going to come up and it doesn't. I even had one patient recently. So I asked a screening question on one of my preliminary spiritual history questions is actually on the initial intake form. When I asked people, this is just something they're doing by themselves with a piece of paper before I even open my mouth, about if they consider themselves religious, spiritual, both, or neither. And it's funny, people have all sorts of different reactions depending on their preparedness to talk about it. For example, this one guy that I alluded to a second ago said no to both. And then he had his operation and then came back in a post-op later and he was like, that question, it really was yes to both. And I'd like to talk about it now. So I was like, okay, why'd you say no? And other people just honestly don't, even though what you and Beth said, I think is true about I like the way you put it, the continuum of care across specialties, the continuum of spiritual care. I find sometimes when people get in with a surgeon, they're like, they're so worried about not having enough time. And there's so much to talk about with the surgery. Often even the people who are the most religious or spiritual, like they don't want to talk about it right then with me. So it's interesting, in fact, maybe Beth knows the literature better than I do, but there's one study I know that I think it might be what Tim Pollack at Ohio State University did in his group. He's been very prolific in the last few years on the intersection of religion and medicine. But I think in one of their surveys, patients really wanted this to be part of their care plan, but a lot of them said they actually didn't want their main physician to provide it, I think because people feel so shortchanged in their time with their physician that they don't want to not get the medical stuff. Especially when you're talking about having an operation, I do somewhat ironically or surprisingly find that sometimes people, even though I know they want to talk about it, they want to get all the surgical and medical stuff done because there's so much to talk about there. So it's something I think needs more visits. Like this guy illustrated when he came back for his post-op, he still had spiritual issues that he wanted to talk about. And that was actually when it came out. So you gotta meet patients where they are, I think.
When that happens, how often are you seeing this manifesting as what I'm thinking of as kind of a dissonance between what someone's religious or spiritual leader might be saying or telling them and what they're experiencing on the other hand? And the reason I ask that is, to what extent are chaplains or providers fulfilling kind of the same role as a priest or a rabbi or whatever, or is this something completely separate? So I'm just wondering, are they struggling with this discrepancy between my faith or my tradition or my philosophy says this, now I'm in this situation and it looks totally different, and my own tradition is not supporting me in the way that I think it could or should.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I think what you're describing is just one of many countless examples of one of the tenets of religious literacy we talked about, which is that religions are diverse. They're internally complex, and they change over time, including people's own interpretations of their religion change over time. No one is locked in to a particular belief set. Things change. It's okay to change your beliefs. Something's wrong if nothing is changing year after year in your religion, your spirituality. That's, in my mind, I think that's not very normal. And I have a really broad range of what I consider to be normalcy. But the other thing is sometimes I think the spiritual care so spiritual care between a surgeon and a patient can happen in a literal way, using Christina's short spiritual history form, FICA or whatever. But I think it also can happen in more subtle ways that sometimes are also very powerful, like just in the way that you talk to people, and the way you look at them in the eye, the way you are there with them and present with them. Because I remember being as a chief resident on the University of Maryland on the surgeon service, it was really easy. You go from room to room. One person just had a failed pancreatectomy. They were metastatic, no surgery done. Everyone sad and disappointed. It's horrible. The next patient, they had a curative intent operation. The next one the other way. Right? So it's like a roller coaster, and it's really easy to go through those rounds, just skirting the surface and talking about the superficial stuff and not really paying attention or going to where the patients are. But it's an entirely different experience to meet each of those patients where they are. You sit down with them on the bed, and you just be there with them for a few minutes, and like that, in my mind, is also a form of spiritual care, even if I didn't in that particular visit take their spiritual history according to FICA. And so, I think the more you're paying attention to spiritual care and religious literacy, and the more you have a clear idea in your head about what it actually means to be religiously literate, the more it facilitates those kinds of meaningful interactions that maybe are more subtle.
I would chime into that, Steve, having worked in a medical intensive care unit where frequently you'd see patients who said, I'm praying for a miracle and I don't want the doctor to do anything to give me bad news or to challenge this notion that God provides miracles. And so what ends up happening is it becomes a very adversarial relationship between the medical team and the patient's family. And sometimes even the chaplain gets lumped in, and it just kind of all blows up. And so I think the more that we can be sensitive to the needs of the individual family members, the individual needs of the patient, and at least engage in a dialogue that says, hey, we're all on the same team. We all want what's best for the patient. We need to talk about what that looks like. And as a chaplain, I think it becomes then, at least in my opinion, saying sometimes miracles come in the form of the person dies in peace, or they die with their loved ones around. They have a good death versus a bad death. But I think engaging in conversations rather than, like you've said, sometimes doctors are like, oh, I don't even want to deal with you if you don't get that this person's dying and that this is grave, they leave. And sometimes I think it means just taking a little bit more time on the part of the physician to say, I'm your ally, not your adversary. And how can we be in this together? Because it sucks. It's a sucky situation. And what you really want is people to be on the journey with you. So I throw that in.
Beth, you keep queuing up these other references to things that the lab is doing. We have a webinar.
I didn't even know.
Yeah, I didn't pay Beth anything for this. Just so you know, this was not a plan. But we have a webinar with Sarah Byrne-Martelli up in Boston that's on Miracle Talk. What happens when patients start talking about miracles, and how should and could chaplains respond to that? Because it's like Beth said, sometimes there is this patient thinks a miracle is going to look like one thing and one thing only, and where the chaplain fits into that is very sort of tenuous and precarious. So thank you for bringing that up. We're coming up on the top of the hour here, so I just want to offer you both a final word here, if you like.
I mean, my final word, I think, to the people in this audience who I think are mostly chaplains, which is, what I say every time I get a chance to chaplains is just thank you for all of your work. It's such important work. And, I think if there was a ratio or an index, we can call it like the Chaplaincy Appreciation Index of like amount of effort and value provided, divided by amount of, appreciation given by surrounding communities, like it would be an impressive index. So thank you.
Well, and Beth has the very brass tacks final word of order the book for your department, start a book club, have a discussion. And by all means, I would stand behind that as well. You can see the QR code right here. You can use that and then use the code LAB, total discount of 35%. That QR code, it's on the website as well. And when you get that follow-up email after this, we'll make sure that all that information is in there as well. So you have plenty of access to that. I want to thank our
Yeah,
guests.
and please spread the word too. Yeah, in
That's
all
the
of your
best-
communities.
The best marketing that any author could ever ask for is word of mouth. So please do that. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and we will see you at the next event. Bye-bye.